As the United Nations marks 80 years since its founding, it is a moment to reflect on Africa's long journey with the global body. Over the decades, Africa has played a significant role in the UN's work, from championing decolonization and human rights to contributing to peacekeeping missions and global governance. The continent's 54 member states, nearly a quarter of the UN, have also provided strong leadership, including two Secretaries-General, Boutros Ghali of Egypt and Kofi Annan of Ghana. At the same time, the UN's footprint in Africa has been profound, supporting peace operations, health and education programs, and efforts towards sustainable development. This week on the program, we look back at Africa and the UN's intertwined history over the 8 decades, the milestones, the challenges, and the reforms still needed to make the institution more representative. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. "80 years on, Africa's story within the United Nations is both rich and complex, from championing decolonization to pushing for reform. To help us reflect on this journey and what it means today, I'm now joined by the Honorable Sam Kahamba Kutesa, former president of the 69th session of the United Nations General Assembly. He's also a former Minister of Foreign Affairs in Uganda. Honorable Kutesa, thank you very much for joining us on the program. Now, it's been 80 years since the UN was formed. Briefly, what has been the most significant achievement of the organization in Africa?
First of all, the United Nations was formed 80 years ago in 1945. And at that time of its formation, other than Ethiopia, the whole of Africa was under colonialism. Therefore, we were not participants at the formation of the United Nations. And even Ethiopia, which was independent, was sort of as an associate member. So the only major achievement that we have had for Africa prior to independence was that the UN was committed to decolonization. And it was a talking platform for the colonized nations to express their views against colonialism and imperialism. So we have had the UN at least as a platform for discussion, and at some other point in time by use of sanctions, such as in the example of against apartheid in South Africa, UN playing a role in the decolonization process of Africa. So that can be said to have been a major achievement. Some of the impactful work of the UN has been through its agencies. For example, the WHO, the World Health Organization, the UNHCR in terms of refugees, the World Food Program, UNDP for development, and UNICEF. These were agencies. These agencies have been helpful in the health sector of African countries, in the education sector, and in the refugee humanitarian assistance areas. So those have been areas in where the UN has been impactful on the African continent. The UN was set up for 3 major reasons. 1, for peace and security. 2, to enforce the rule of law, international law. And 3, to talk about development and to help countries develop. In the areas of peace and security, you have the Security Council mainly, then you have the International Courts of Justice for the rule of law, and you have ECOSOC for development. So these were the main reasons why the UN was set up in the first place.
So I want to talk about the issue of decolonization that you have mentioned, though. In which way do you think the United Nations was crucial in challenging the political legitimacy of colonial powers, particularly during the height of the Cold War?
Well, not all members of the United Nations were important about fighting the imperialism and colonialism, because some of the countries that actually are in the Security Council and members of the UN were themselves the colonial powers. Some countries, especially the USSR, the People's Republic of China, later on when it joined the Security Council and the UN, those are the ones who really helped in the decolonization process by supporting the liberation struggles of Africa to become independent against some members of the UN, like France, like Britain, who were the colonial powers. So the UN also provided a forum through which other independent countries could speak against colonialism and imperialism. And sometimes it would pass resolutions that condemned colonial acts and imperialist acts. At later stages, it was able to impose sanctions, for example, against South Africa when we were fighting apartheid. But so its role in decolonization is a mixed bag, because some of the members, as I said, of the UN were the colonial powers against whom we were fighting for independence.
So let's talk about the African leaders, the UN Secretary-Generals from Africa. Boutros Ghali served as UN Secretary-General from 1992 to 96, and Kofi Annan served from 1997 to 2006. Kofi Annan succeeded Boutros Ghali with his term starting immediately after Boutros Ghali's ended. What are your reflections on this unprecedented role that Africa played in giving the UN its top leadership back to back?
It was good that Boutros Ghali and Kofi Annan became Secretary Generals of the United Nations, and they came from Africa. Their role was to highlight the problems in Africa. I think while they are Secretary Generals of the United Nations, they are working within the limitations and the boundaries set for the Secretary General in terms of the agenda of the United Nations. I can say that, for example, in the days of Kofi Annan, although these goals were for the whole world, he did initiate the Millennium Development Goals. And those Millennium Development Goals were of great impact, 8 of them on Africa. Its development, its health, its improvement on the women rights and democratization. So those development goals, Millennium Development Goals, were, I think, a very impactful introduction by Kofi Annan in his time. Unfortunately, Boutros Ghali didn't last very long. 4 years in the affairs of the world is a short time. Even 8 years is a short time. But I think the Millennium Development Goals come out as the outstanding feature of Kofi Annan's tenure as Secretary General.
All right. So, Honorable Kutesa, so what are your reflections on the idea behind the formation of the African Group, the continent's 54 member states, a voting bloc at the UN?
At the UN, especially in the General Assembly, numbers count. The UN has got 193 members, and 54 is quite a sizable number. And for the Africans to come together and act as a bloc was a good thing, because after that, then they joined with the group of 77 plus China, which is nearly almost 131 countries. And this is a formidable group when you want to pass a resolution at the United Nations. And when they speak with one voice, it gives their voice strength, and they pass resolutions where numbers are required. So the formation of an African bloc, the speaking with one voice, the sheer impact of numbers was a very important thing to put together. And I think it has been playing a big part in forming the direction of the UN, especially the General Assembly.
Right. So I want to talk a bit about peace and security. You did talk about peace and security being a core mandate of the United Nations, but it is difficult to talk about the UN in Africa and Africa in the UN without mentioning the Rwandan genocide, which happened when the UN was under the stewardship of Africa. What are your reflections on this episode?
It was a total shame on the part of the UN. It was a total shame on the part of all democracies. It was a total shame on the world that we couldn't come together to stop the genocide in Rwanda. In some measure, it was a bit of a racist abstinence, so to speak, because where there was similar attempts at genocide, like in Kosovo, the NATO moved in quickly and stopped it. But it was a shame for the United Nations and its inaction in Rwanda. And actually, not only just the United Nations, but the entire world community, both collectively and individually.
So what are the abiding lessons for the UN and humanity of the failure to prevent the Rwanda genocide?
The world seems to be countenancing genocide even by other countries, even post the Rwanda genocide. We seem not to have learned any lessons. Because of the veto at the UN Security Council, as I said, countries seem to get away even with genocide and crimes against humanity without any repercussions. And in this sense, I think there is a failure on the part of the international community in reining in states or actors, even non-state actors that perpetuate genocide. It's still a reflection on the weaknesses of the United Nations, both in Security Council and the General Assembly, and that's hence the need for reform.
So let's talk a little bit about those reforms. What kind of key reforms do you think the UN needs at the moment?
One of the major reforms, and I pushed it when I was president of the UN General Assembly, was a reform of the Security Council to expand its membership. One, for example, in Africa, we have the Israeli consensus and the Security Declaration, where Africa should have 2 seats, permanent seats, with equal power. Permanent seats with a veto, like all other countries who are members of the Security Council. The other one, is, apart from expansion, it is the improvement of the works of the General Assembly. What are the resolutions? What is the impact of the resolutions of the General Assembly? How enforceable do they become? We need to reform the UN Security Council, especially for the purpose of maintaining peace and security in the world. Because right now, as I said, it is the most undemocratic institution or part of the UN, and yet it's so crucial. If you take the example of Africa, about 80% of the issues that come before the UN Security Council are about Africa. And Africa is not in the Security Council, is not on the table to participate in the decisions upon which are being made on issues relating to Africa. How can that be democratic? How can it be fair? As a result, the problems are never solved, or wrong decisions are always made, and they become counterproductive, and in the end, instability continues in Africa. So there is a need to reform the Security Council, no question about it.
And African nations are also calling for the UN Charter to be protected from abuse by powerful members. How will they go about this?
That's one other side of it. Even the little that there is in the UN Security Council, or rather in the UN Charter that protects rights of nations, that give each nation equal rights, like in the United Nations and the United Nations General Assembly, some countries, big countries, flout even those provisions. So Africa says the little that is there and that is good in the UN should be protected as we look to reforming other parts which need reforms. So Africa is right in demanding that the Charter should be protected, especially on human rights, especially on development, especially in stopping imperialism and colonization of other countries by force. So Africa is right to appeal for observance of the Charter. That does not take away the need to reform the Charter itself.
So I want to conclude with a quote by former UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan in his book, Interventions, A Life in War and Peace. Kofi Annan writes, and I quote, "Africa, the poverty of Africa, the violence of Africa is not the product of its environment, but rather the consequence of choices and decisions made by its leaders." Do you agree?
He's partly right. We have had poor leadership sometimes, but there is also external interference. External interference in the affairs of the continent, in economic terms, in security terms. Yes, there is something we need to blame ourselves for about our own leaders. Some of our leaders have been extremely corrupt. Others have been extremely dictatorial. Others have made the wrong choices. Actually, they have, by being against the interests of their own nations. But on the whole, the problem of Africa has been Africans not coming together and rejecting external control and finding better ways of utilizing their resources, both natural and human, to advance the continent, because we have enormous resources and that the world is looking for. But every country, every foreign nation is trying to interfere in Africa to exploit the resources we have, and in so doing, dividing us. I think, yes, maybe Kofi Annan is right in only one sense, that one of the biggest problems of African leaders has been failure to unite and fight against foreign interests and fight for the interests of Africa.
Honorable Kutesa, thank you very much for your reflections. On that note, let's take a short break, and when we return, we shift our focus to the challenges ahead as the UN faces major funding cuts and pressure on its global programs. What could this mean for Africa's development and for the future of multilateral cooperation? To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. 80 years on, the partnership between Africa and the United Nations continues to evolve. But how can it stay relevant in a changing world? I'm now joined by Ambassador Mutaz Ahmadine Khalil, a former Egyptian permanent representative to the United Nations, to share his reflections on the path forward. Ambassador Khalil, thank you for joining us on the program. Now, the UN will need to cut $500 million from next year's budget and lose 20% of its staff as it struggles to cope with massive reduction in funding by the Trump administration. Broadly, why should Africa worry about US funding cuts?
About the United Nations, of course, I would like to speak that it has a very important role for Africa in the past, present, and future. In the past, it played a very important role in decolonization, which affected most of the African continent. But speaking about the present, this acute financial crisis caused by the policies of the new American administration, of course, is a source of worry for Africa and for all the world. But Africa in particular is vulnerable to these funding cuts because the three pillars of United Nations work, namely peacekeeping and security, peace and security, which includes peacekeeping, development, which includes sustainable development, and humanitarian work, including human rights. All three are very important to Africa. So it is not only the development assistance that is going to be affected, but also the capacity of the United Nations to send mediators and peace envoys in different areas of conflict, including and especially in Africa, and to keep up with the peacekeeping missions. And of course, the humanitarian work of the United Nations, including assistance for refugees and opening up and providing health services and many other services for the populations of the poor populations of the world, and for African countries that are in need of development and international assistance in particular.
So let's talk about the health sector, because Africa's health sector receives a lot of funding, not only from the UN, but also from international funders. UNAIDS is an agency under the UN that deals with AIDS response, and it is set to close in 2026. What will be the impact on Africa, and why is it expected that this US funding cuts to the UN will create immediate or devastating impact on Africa's health sector?
Of course, the UNAIDS was a very successful program for Africa. It succeeded in reducing the risk of AIDS in African women and children for more than 60%. Now, of course, when we cut the funding to UNAIDS and we stop its program in 2026 instead of 2030, this is going to be a setback. The gains that have been acquired during the past life of the program, including this 60% risk reduction, can be lost. This is one main aspect of the impact. Another impact is the loss in the provision of the necessary medication and hospital care in poor areas that cannot be reached by the governments in normal conditions. All of these, again, will result in more death for vulnerable people in Africa, including, of course, women and children. This is one example. And also, the United States sets a bad example for other donors around the world, because if the United States falls back and do not put up their voluntary contributions, many other countries would follow suit, including in Europe and maybe in other parts of the world as well, which compounds the effects of the budget cuts and the financial shortcomings.
Right, so let's look a little bit on multilateralism here. Why is it in the interest of Africa, or is it in the interest of Africa, that multilateralism survives in spite of the setbacks it has suffered in recent years?
It is absolutely in the interests of Africa and the world as well that multilateralism survives, because now there is a trend among major countries to go alone, to do bilateral aid in order to gain more leverage and affect the voting and the different positions of different countries. But in reality, this is not a sustainable way to deal or direct international relations, because when you do it alone or you do it bilateral or one-on-one, you do not take into account the different interests and positions of different countries, and you are more going towards a zero-sum game when there is a strong country that takes it all and that even benefits from the aid, while the vulnerable country may receive some aid but cannot juggle its commitments between different donors and cannot juggle even its commitments to its own population. Sometimes they impose on the smaller countries certain economic policies that do not necessarily work in the benefit of the people. They may impose on them tariffs, like the newly discovered tool that President Trump is using day and night, and they may push them to conflict with other neighboring countries that are not behaving themselves to the liking of the big donor country. This is one aspect. The other aspect is the competition between donors and the donors following each other and reducing tensions and not paying attention to multilateralism.
Right, so let's talk about that multilateralism for a little bit because there are a lot of changes in geopolitics happening at the moment. How can countries uphold multilateralism against the background of these geopolitical shifts?
I believe that the international community should reaffirm its commitment to multilateralism. Yes, the United Nations needs reform. It needs some budget cuts in order to achieve efficiency. This is all acceptable, but there should be a collective vision among developing and developed countries to abide by the rules of the United Nations, by the rules of international law, and withstand these 3 tough years that are left for the current United States administration. Because if you go along with the pressures applied by the American administration to the United Nations and to the international community, I think that will be a lose-lose situation. And in this context, other strong countries should step up both their voluntary contributions to different programs that are implemented by the United Nations, and as well their bilateral assistance programs. They should not be affected, but they should abide by and coordinate with the rules of the United Nations and the programs that reflect global consensus on the many standards that have been developed by the United Nations and its specialized agencies along the 80 years of the life of the United Nations in different domains, including development, trade, financial rules and orders, health, culture, education, and many other fields.
Right, so I want to get your final comments, Ambassador Khalil, and I want to briefly look ahead as you give your closing comments. How is the state of the cutbacks of the UN funding challenging Africa's reliance on foreign aid? What do you see briefly as the risks and the opportunities?
In addition to the risks that we have talked about neglecting the needs of Africa, there is an opportunity here. There is an opportunity for the African countries to start depending more on themselves, on their own resources, and on their own cooperation. We have the African Union, which is the regional organization that supervises cooperation in the same fields and domains of the United Nations: peace and security, development, and humanitarian assistance. And there is a lot of coordinated work between the African Union and the United Nations. But maybe the African countries should start to develop their own capabilities and grow up independent from the foreign aid. I'm not saying that foreign aid should be cut, but it should be rationalized and should be utilized for the benefit of the peoples of Africa, and not only for the benefit of the donor or according to their political whims or mood swings.
Ambassador Khalil, thank you very much. And that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our guests, Honorable Sam Kahamba Kutesa, former president of the 69th session of the United Nations General Assembly, and Ambassador Mutaz Ahmadine Khalil, former Egyptian permanent representative to the United Nations. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and X, and you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, it's goodbye.